The distant wail of sirens should have been a relief. Instead, my stomach dropped as I watched Deborah Wellington Pierce plant her designer heels at our neighborhood entrance, arms crossed like some discount dictator. My 5-year-old daughter was having a seizure, and this woman, our HOA president, was blocking the $1,200 0 cents per trip ambulance because they hadn't followed proper entrance protocol? But she didn't know I fly medical evacuations for a living. 3 minutes after she blocked that ambulance, I called in a favor that had a $4,200,000 0 cent helicopter descending on our community green space, while neighbors filmed the whole thing on their phones. What would you do if someone put their power trip above your family's life? Would you roll over? Or would you fight back with everything you've got? Drop your hometown in the comments. I bet you've got HOA stories of your own. I never wanted to go to war with our homeowners association. All I wanted was a safe place for my family, especially Emma. My name's Sam Cooper. I'm 38, and I've been flying medical evacuation helicopters for Regional Hospital going on 11 years now. My wife Elaine works as a pediatric nurse on the night shift at the same hospital. That's actually how we met, when I brought in a kid from a car wreck and she was assigned to his care. We're what you might call a medical family. Our daughter Emma had just turned 5 when she was diagnosed with epilepsy. The first seizure happened at preschool, scared the living daylights out of her teachers and honestly, out of us too. After a battery of tests and more hospital visits than I care to remember, we had our answer: epilepsy, probably for life. That first morning in our new Lakeside Meadows home should have been perfect. The smell of fresh paint mingling with pancakes and Emma's laughter, it was everything we'd saved for. Better school district, safer neighborhood, a fresh start where Emma's condition wouldn't define her. "Daddy, can I have the Mickey Mouse pancake?" Emma asked, her brown curls still messy from sleep. "You got it, princess, 1 Mickey coming right up," I said, pouring the batter carefully. "What do you think of the new house?" "I like that my room is pink," she declared, as if that settled everything. Lakeside Meadows was, on paper, perfect. Good schools, manicured lawns, a community pool. And, as we'd soon discover, an HOA with more rules than the Federal Aviation Administration. The queen bee of this hive was Deborah Wellington Pierce, a 50-something real estate broker whose family had been in the area for 3 generations, a fact she managed to work into every conversation. I should have known we were in trouble when she called an emergency HOA meeting the week after we moved in. The meeting room's air conditioner hummed exactly like a hospital waiting room, that familiar drone that seems designed to set your teeth on edge while you wait for bad news. "We have new residents," Deborah announced to the board like she was reporting an infestation, and already they've made unauthorized structural modifications. I tried to explain about Emma's emergency epilepsy alarm system. The doctor required it, flashing lights outside the house to alert neighbors if Emma had a seizure when Elaine was sleeping after her night shift. A medical necessity, not a decoration. Deborah's smile never reached her eyes. "Rules are rules, Mr. Cooper. If we let one person break them, where does it end? Swimming pools in front yards, cars on blocks." The next day, I found a $750 0 cents fine notice on our door. The paper-cut feel of its edge as I crumpled it matched the sharp anger rising in my throat. My flight instructor always said I had the patience of a saint. Right up until... I don't. Deborah was about to find the line. "Amy?" "Deborah." After 2 weeks of emails, phone calls, and one very uncomfortable confrontation in the dairy aisle at Kroger, the HOA board finally approved an emergency exemption for Emma's alert system. Victory, right? Wrong. The approval came with conditions. The lights needed to be neighborhood aesthetic compatible, which apparently meant tiny, beige, and practically invisible. The original system, recommended by Emma's neurologist, had bright LED strobes that could catch a neighbor's attention even if they were inside with curtains drawn. The HOA-approved version might as well have been Christmas lights in July. These modifications will reduce the effectiveness by at least 60%, I explained, as Deborah personally inspected the installation. She adjusted her pearl necklace. Your emergency doesn't trump property values, Mr. Cooper. The committee was very generous to allow this at all. I watched her survey my yard like she was looking for landmines. The other neighbors, standing on their perfectly trimmed lawns, seemed uncomfortable, but said nothing. Bystanders, every one of them. As she walked away, I overheard her mutter to another board member, "These medical types think rules don't apply to them." The metallic taste in my mouth as I swallowed my anger reminded me of the air after a lightning strike, charged and dangerous. That night, after Emma was asleep, I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and a determination I usually reserved for flying through mountain passes in bad weather. I may fly helicopters for a living, but now I was getting a crash course in property law. Trust me, one is definitely more fun than the other. 3 hours and a pot of coffee later, I had my counterattack. The Fair Housing Act has specific provisions for reasonable accommodations for medical conditions. No HOA bylaw could override federal law. I drafted a certified letter citing the exact legal code, attached a new letter from Emma's doctor specifying the requirements for an effective alert system, and for good measure got our community physician, an ER doctor who sometimes flies with me on evacuations, to sign off on the medical necessity. Deborah was legally cornered. The board approved our original system, but she wasn't about to surrender gracefully. Suddenly, our yard needed landscaping inspections every 2 weeks. Our trash cans were visible from the street if you stood at exactly the right angle and squinted. But we had our lights, and Emma had her safety net. The real eye-opener came when I was installing the modified system. A glint of metal caught my attention from the oak tree near our property line. A security camera, pointed directly at our house. A little investigation revealed it wasn't the only one. Deborah had installed HOA security cameras that just happened to be monitoring our family specifically, with feeds going directly to her phone. "That's crossing a line," said Frank Peterson, the retired lawyer who lived across the street. He'd wandered over while I was examining the cameras. "Privacy laws exist for a reason. She can't do that." With Frank's help, we drafted another letter, this time invoking state privacy statutes. The cameras came down within 48 hours. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. The neighborhood was watching, and not everyone liked what they saw. It was a perfect Tuesday afternoon when Emma had her next seizure. She'd been playing in the front yard with the neighbor's daughter when she suddenly stiffened and fell. Mrs. Chen from next door saw it happen and immediately called 911 while activating our alert system. I was at work, 30 minutes away by car, but only 7 minutes by helicopter. Elaine was sleeping after her night shift. The ambulance arrived at our community gate within minutes, lights flashing, only to find itself stuck at the security checkpoint. "I need to verify this emergency with the HOA president," the guard told the paramedics, looking miserable but following protocol. "New security measures for commercial vehicles." "This is an ambulance," the lead paramedic said incredulously. "There's a child having a seizure." According to Mrs. Chen, who witnessed the whole thing, Deborah took her sweet time arriving at the gate. "I need to confirm this is a real emergency," she told the guard. "We've had landscaping trucks try to pass as service vehicles before." By the time she verified the emergency, the paramedics had given up waiting. They grabbed their equipment and ran the 300 yards to our house, arriving sweaty and furious. Emma was stable by the time they reached her. This time, but her neurologist later told us that with a different type of seizure, those delays could have been catastrophic. The rage I felt that day was like nothing I'd experienced before. It was pure, distilled, and focused entirely on Deborah Wellington Pierce. I documented everything: statements from the paramedics, Mrs. Chen's account, the security camera footage from our doorbell showing the paramedics arriving on foot. Then I filed a formal complaint with County Emergency Services. While researching my case, I discovered something interesting. The HOA's insurance policy didn't cover liability for medical emergency interference. If Emma had been seriously harmed due to their delay tactics, the personal assets of board members could have been at risk. Ever notice how homeowners' eyes get real wide when you start talking about their personal assets being on the hook? I compiled this information and circulated it to neighbors. Did you know your home could be at risk if the HOA is sued for blocking emergency services? Elaine, who usually plays peacemaker to my fighter pilot tendencies, surprised me by organizing an emergency response information session for the neighborhood. 37 families attended. Deborah did not. You know how helicopter pilots are trained to find landing zones in emergencies? Turns out, finding holes in HOA bylaws requires the exact same skill set. Both involve scanning hostile territory for a safe place to maneuver. The warning letter from County Emergency Services to the HOA board arrived 3 days later. Deborah immediately called an emergency board meeting where she blamed me for overreaction and endangering property values with negative attention. The vote of confidence in her leadership barely passed, 4-3. The cracks were starting to show. That's when I discovered that Deborah's real estate company handled 80% of the home sales in our neighborhood. Every time property values went up, so did her commission. Every time a family left because of her harassment, she collected another fee. This wasn't just about power. It was about money. If I thought Deborah was difficult before, it was nothing compared to what came next. Suddenly, our street needed traffic calming measures. Translation: 5 new speed bumps installed precisely along my route home, each one tall enough to make your teeth rattle. Never mind that it would slow down any future emergency vehicles. That was probably the point. A week later, the landscaping crew accidentally damaged our emergency light system during common area maintenance. The head of the crew apologized profusely, mentioning that Mrs. Wellington Pierce was very specific about cutting back the branches near your equipment. Then came the notes, tucked under our windshield wipers, shoved in our mailbox. Problem families bring down neighborhood value. Medical issues should be handled in medical facilities. Each one anonymous, each one a paper bullet. The worst part was watching other parents gradually stop letting their kids play with Emma. Somehow, a rumor had started that epilepsy was contagious to other children. The playground would clear out when we arrived. I came home early one day to find Emma sitting alone on our porch swing. "Why doesn't anyone want to play with me anymore, Daddy?" Her little voice broke something in me. This wasn't just about bylaws anymore. That weekend, I installed security cameras covering every angle of our property, completely within HOA guidelines since they were aesthetically compatible and under the size limit. Within 3 days, we caught footage of the landscaping crew deliberately tampering with our alert system. Again. Meanwhile, I'd been researching those speed bumps. Turns out, they had been improperly installed on what was technically a county access route. One call to the county inspector, and they were ordered removed. At the HOA's expense of $3,200, 0 cents. Elaine, normally the quiet one in our partnership, organized an epilepsy awareness workshop at the neighborhood clubhouse. We expected maybe a handful of people. 23 families showed up. As it turns out, we weren't the only ones tired of Deborah's regime. After consulting with Frank the lawyer, I filed a formal disability discrimination complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The federal government tends to take these things seriously. At this point, I was spending more time studying HOA bylaws than flight manuals. The difference: one is written to be understood, the other's designed by people who charge by the confusion. The county inspector who came about the speed bumps mentioned something interesting on his way out. "You know, I've been meaning to look into several other compliance issues in this neighborhood. Seems like there's a pattern here." That casual comment led me down a rabbit hole of public records. It turned out that several of Deborah's personal property modifications, her extended patio, decorative water feature, and 6-foot privacy fence, were never approved by her own committee. Different standards for the queen bee and her worker bees. I began collecting evidence of selective enforcement. Photographs, dates, documentation of which violations were punished and which were overlooked. The pattern was clear. Friends of the board got warnings. Enemies got fines. The battle lines were drawn. I just didn't know how deep the corruption went. "You need to see this," Frank said, dropping a folder on my patio table one evening. As a retired real estate attorney, he had access to research tools I didn't. Inside were public records on Lakeside Meadows going back to its foundation. The original community covenants required 75% homeowner approval for any changes to emergency access procedures. Deborah had pushed through the new ambulance verification protocol with only a board vote. 7 people making decisions for 300 families. But that wasn't all. The original property deeds included specific easements for emergency vehicles that couldn't be legally restricted. That document was conspicuously missing from the current HOA files. "Keep going," Frank said, tapping another section. "This is where it gets interesting." The financial disclosures showed HOA reserves significantly lower than reported in our annual newsletter. Over $120,000, 0 cents, had been transferred to a vaguely named Community Enhancement Fund that appeared to be controlled solely by Deborah. The most damning discovery came last. Deborah's real estate company had an exclusivity agreement with the HOA. Not only did she receive commission on all home sales, but she also collected a 1% community transfer fee that wasn't disclosed to buyers. With average home prices around $450,000, 0 cents, each turnover netted her approximately $15,000, 0 cents, 20,000. No wonder she was so obsessed with property values and pushing out undesirable residents. "This is actionable," Frank said, his lawyer voice emerging. "Potentially criminal, depending on how the finances were represented to the state." I consulted with an attorney specializing in HOA law who confirmed our suspicions. The financial arrangement likely violated state statutes on disclosure and conflict of interest. While I was building my case, Emma had another seizure. This time I didn't call an ambulance. Instead, I made a different call, one that would change everything. You know that moment when you realize the chess game you thought you were playing is actually full combat boxing? I was done moving pawns. Time to put on the gloves. My first call went to Dr. Rivera, the hospital administrator who oversaw the medical evacuation program. "Sam, legally speaking, this is serious," she said after hearing the full story. "That HOA president interfered with emergency medical services. If your daughter had suffered harm because of the delay..." She let the implications hang in the air. Over the next week, I assembled my allies like a general preparing for battle. Frank, the retired lawyer, drafted a formal legal challenge to the HOA's practices. 3 other families with medical needs who'd experienced similar harassment came forward, with documentation. Maya Chen, a local reporter whose mother had epilepsy, took a special interest in the story. The county emergency services director was concerned about the liability precedent being set. My helicopter medical team stood ready to assist if needed. We gathered in our basement on a Tuesday night, spread our evidence across the ping-pong table, and developed our strategy. "First thing you need to understand," Frank said, addressing the group, "is that HOA board members have personal liability when acting outside the scope of their authority. Knowledge nugget 1. When HOA board members break their own rules, their personal assets are on the line, not just the community funds. Second," he continued, "federal ADA protections supersede HOA covenants when it comes to medical accommodations. Knowledge nugget 2. No neighborhood rule can legally prevent reasonable accommodations for medical conditions, period." Maya, the reporter, was taking notes. "What about all the selective enforcement you've documented?" Frank nodded grimly. "Creates a legal precedent that potentially makes other rules unenforceable. Courts hate inconsistency." Knowledge nugget 3. When an HOA enforces rules differently for different people, They're essentially voiding their own authority. We formulated a plan to force an emergency board election. A little-known bylaw clause required an election when 30% of homeowners petitioned for one. We already had 22% on board. Dr. Rivera brought up the financial angle. HOA financial records are legally required to be transparent to all members. Have you requested a formal audit? Knowledge nugget. 4. Every homeowner has the right to see exactly where their HOA fees go, down to the last dollar. By midnight, we had our battle plan. Continue gathering petition signatures while preparing a formal presentation on the actual versus reported HOA finances. Develop an emergency response plan that met county requirements, and be ready for Deborah's inevitable countermove. My flight control checklists were nothing compared to our take down the HOA battle plan. The difference? If I miss a step in the helicopter, I might crash. If we missed a step here, we'd still be fixing Deborah's crown while bowing to her property standards. The next morning, Elaine got a call from Emma's neurologist. She needed surgery to implant a device that would help control her seizures. The procedure was scheduled for next month. The recovery would require even more accommodations at home. Our timeline had just accelerated. Deborah caught wind of our petition within days. Her response was swift and predictable. An emergency meeting to change the election rules, attempting to install a 60-day waiting period on special elections. I stood up during the meeting. Point of order. You can't change election procedures without proper notice to all homeowners. It's in the bylaws, section 4.3. This is an emergency measure for community stability, Deborah countered. Mr. Cooper, you're being disruptive. I'm citing the actual rules, Madam President. Her face flushed crimson. Security, please remove Mr. Cooper for disruptive behavior. Being escorted out by a rent-a-cop half my age wasn't my proudest moment, but the other homeowners saw it happen. More signatures came in that night than in the previous week combined. The next day, a certified letter arrived threatening litigation for defamation of character and interfering with HOA operations. It demanded I cease all slanderous communications regarding board activities. The day after that, I learned Deborah had approached my boss at the hospital, suggesting my personal vendetta might affect my professional judgment as a pilot. Fortunately, Dr. Rivera had already briefed the flight director on the situation. Then the landscaping company began daily work outside our house at 7 a.m. sharp, mowing, edging, leaf-blowing the same patch of grass over and over. When I filed a noise complaint, it was mysteriously lost in processing. Behind the scenes, our movement was growing. We now had signatures from 40% of the neighborhood, well beyond the threshold needed. The hospital administration publicly backed me after hearing the full story. Our legal team prepared a formal complaint to the state attorney general regarding financial improprieties. I installed additional cameras, documented all HOA interactions, and made sure nothing was left to chance. During this research, we discovered something else interesting. Deborah's company hadn't been paying proper transfer taxes on the community fees it collected, potential tax fraud that stretched back years. Ever notice how the people most obsessed with rules are often the ones breaking the biggest ones? It's like the HOA version of speeding cops giving tickets. Just as we were preparing to file our formal petition, Emma's doctor called with an update. Her surgery had been moved up due to a cancellation. She would be going in next week, meaning our timeline for HOA reform had suddenly compressed from weeks to days. That evening, I received an unexpected call from an old Air Force buddy who now worked for the FAA. Sam, about that training exercise you mentioned. I think we can help. Deborah's response to our growing momentum was a master class in desperate measures. A 4-page letter appeared in every mailbox warning homeowners of potential legal expenses if my frivolous complaints continued. According to her calculations, property values could drop 15% if excessive accommodations became standard practice. Her solution? A special assessment of $2,000, 0 cents per household for a legal defense fund. The vote was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Wednesday when most working residents couldn't attend. That same day, a private security firm appeared in unmarked cars, supposedly to monitor community safety. In reality, they were tracking who visited our house, taking photos of license plates, and creating an atmosphere of surveillance that would have made the Stasi proud. The lowest blow came when a county social worker knocked on our door, explaining they'd received an anonymous call suggesting Emma's medical needs weren't being properly met. The implication that we were neglectful parents was almost more than I could bear. But Deborah had made a critical mistake. She'd pushed me to the point where I had nothing left to lose. I made 3 phone calls that night. The next morning, residents of Lakeside Meadows woke to an official notice: emergency medical training exercise to be conducted in Lakeside Meadows Community Park, 9 a.m. Saturday. FAA approved. Residents welcome to observe. What the notice didn't mention was that the training exercise would involve landing a medical evacuation helicopter, my helicopter, in the middle of our community green space. Completely legal under FAA regulations for training purposes. As Saturday dawned clear and bright, I was already at the hospital preparing for our training mission. My co-pilot, Ramirez, couldn't stop grinning. "Man, I cannot believe we're actually doing this." "Totally routine training exercise," I said, trying to keep a straight face. "Just happens to be in my neighborhood." By 8:45, curious neighbors were already gathering at the park. At 8:50, Maya the reporter arrived with a camera crew from the local news station. At 8:55, Deborah stormed onto the field, cell phone in hand. At precisely 9 a.m., our Bell 429 appeared over the tree line, rotors thumping hard enough to rattle windows for half a mile. The downwash alone was enough to send Deborah's perfectly styled hair into next Tuesday as we executed a textbook landing in the center of the field. As I stepped out in full flight gear, Frank and his team were distributing information packets to all homeowners detailing the financial irregularities and discrimination patterns we'd uncovered. The cameras captured everything, including Deborah attempting to physically block the distribution, screaming about unauthorized gatherings and restricted airspace. Interfering with aircraft operations is a federal offense. The expression on her face when the FAA representative informed her of this fact was worth every second of harassment we'd endured. While this very public display was unfolding, our lawyer was filing an emergency injunction against the special assessment. The county commissioner, whom I'd once transported after a heart attack, personally called the HOA attorney to express grave concerns about the community's emergency access policies. They say never bring a knife to a gunfight, while Deborah brought a rule book to a helicopter battle. Later that day, the CPS investigation was formally dismissed as baseless after we provided hospital documentation of Emma's care. The social worker, clearly embarrassed by the situation, privately revealed this wasn't the first complaint originating from the HOA against families with special needs. In fact, a pattern emerged. 3 families had previously moved away after similar harassment campaigns. The tide had definitively turned. The County Emergency Services Committee called a public hearing on neighborhood access issues the following Tuesday. The community center was standing room only. Homeowners, medical professionals, county officials, and media packed the space like sardines. I arrived with Emma, her first public appearance since the ambulance incident. She wore her favorite unicorn shirt and clutched her stuffed bunny, innocent to the tension in the room. People smiled at her as we walked in. Several patted my shoulder in silent support. Deborah arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by the HOA attorney and a security guard, her heels clicking aggressively across the tile floor. The room fell silent as she walked to the front row, not making eye contact with anyone. County Commissioner Harlow opened the proceedings. "We're here to address emergency access requirements for all residential communities in our jurisdiction. Recent incidents have raised serious concerns about current practices." The County Emergency Services Director presented new guidelines requiring all gated communities to provide immediate access to emergency vehicles without verification procedures. When public comments began, Deborah was first to the microphone. While we appreciate the county's concern, established communities like Lakeside Meadows should be granted grandfather clause exemptions based on our property values and existing security protocols, she argued. Our residents specifically chose our neighborhood for its exclusive nature. Then it was my turn. I approached the podium, tablet in hand. My name is Sam Cooper. I'm a medical evacuation pilot, but more importantly, I'm the father of a child who was endangered by current HOA practices. I presented our evidence methodically. Original easement documents proving emergency access was never legally restricted. Financial records showing misappropriation of HOA funds. Documentation of selective enforcement and discrimination. Medical evidence of the danger caused by access delays. The room was silent as I spoke, but the real bombshell came next. The county has obtained the emergency dispatch recording from the incident involving my daughter, I said. With the committee's permission, I'd like to play it for the record. The audio filled the room. Gate attendant. I have an ambulance requesting entry for a medical emergency at 1242 Lakeside Drive. Deborah. What kind of emergency? Gate attendant. Child having a seizure, ma'am. Deborah. I don't care if it's an emergency. They need to learn to follow procedure. Tell them to wait while I verify. Gasps filled the room. The county emergency director's face hardened. This recording will be entered into evidence for the pending investigation into potential criminal negligence, he announced. I continued. Our petition for board dissolution has been signed by 68% of Lakeside Meadows homeowners. I held up the thick stack of signatures. Additionally, 3 board members have already resigned after reviewing the financial documentation we've provided. Deborah leapt to her feet. This is a coordinated attack on property values by people who simply don't belong in premium communities, she shouted. The room froze. Every head turned toward her. Camera lenses zoomed in. Would you care to clarify that statement, Mrs. Wellington Pierce? The county commissioner asked icily. You could hear a pin drop, or in this case, the sound of a career in real estate circling the drain. The aftermath came swiftly. The county commissioner appointed a temporary administrator to oversee HOA operations. Deborah resigned before a formal vote could remove her, and the state real estate board opened a review of her license. Emergency access protocols were revised, not just for our community, but for every gated neighborhood in the county. I was elected to the interim neighborhood board, along with a diverse group that included 2 other families with medical needs. The transformation of our community was remarkable. We implemented a neighborhood emergency response program that became a model for the entire county. A safe haven certification was established for neighborhoods with medical-friendly policies. Emma's surgery was successful. During her recovery, neighbors we barely knew brought meals, offered child care for hospital visits, and formed a support network I never thought possible in a place that once felt so hostile. Deborah listed her house 3 weeks after the hearing. She moved to an apartment complex in the next county over. I hear it doesn't have an HOA. 6 months later, we hosted the first Accessible Neighborhood Workshop, inviting HOA boards from across the state to learn about inclusive policies. Our community installed a central emergency response system with a direct hospital link. Using the settlement money from our successful lawsuit against the former board, we established a scholarship fund for children with epilepsy. Our annual neighborhood block party now includes a fundraiser for medical accessibility initiatives. And yes, my helicopter team does an annual demonstration landing in the park. It's become a beloved community tradition that kids look forward to all year. Turns out, landing a helicopter was a lot easier than landing a fair HOA policy. But unlike helicopter fuel, this change doesn't burn out. It keeps helping families like ours every single day. The real surprise came a year later. I got an emergency call for a patient needing airlift from a car accident on the interstate. When we landed, I recognized the victim being loaded into the ambulance. Deborah. Despite everything, my training kicked in. We got her to the hospital in record time, provided the best care possible. 2 weeks later, A letter arrived acknowledging my professionalism and offering a genuine apology for what had happened. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's creating the change that should have been there all along. Last month, we installed a new sign at the neighborhood entrance, Emergency Access Route, dedicated to Emma and all the other families who deserve to feel safe in their homes. This wouldn't have happened without neighbors standing together against abuse of power. Share your HOA nightmare stories in the comments below. You're definitely not alone. And hit subscribe, because next week, I'll tell you about the time our school principal tried to expel Emma for her medical equipment, and how one teacher risked everything to help us fight back.